The way that we're scheduling this meeting is we have 2 hours that we do our chapter meetings every month. We cover just general PDA PDA business in the first roughly 30 minutes. We're going to try and get through that pretty quickly so that we can jump right into the panel. So some of the things that we talk about, let me just pull up my notes here so I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so we obviously have way too many people on the call to do like introductions. Normally, we have a much smaller group and we talk about like our name, where we're from, and why we're involved in this. But obviously, we have way too many of you on the call to do something like that. So we're going to reserve that time for the speakers to introduce themselves and talk about who they are and what their credentials are and why it's important for us to hear their voices tonight. Okay, the other thing that we do what's called Educate Congress. But before I get into the Educate Congress stuff, which I don't know, Alan, do we actually have an Educate Congress thing this month? Because I don't recall there being a call.
No, we took the time off this month so that everybody can participate in advocacy for progressive candidates and for defeating Donald Trump. So sorry if that was not clear from PDA National. We did leave the opportunity open, but it seems even some of the bills and of course the stimulus, you know, hair on fire, nothing's happening there. So hair on fire for nothing, that sort of defines 2020 almost.
Right.
No, there was not right now a planned letter drop for this 1 month because of election hearing, focus on election hearing.
Okay, no problem. So normally, just for the rest of you who have not attended one of our meetings before, we, on a monthly basis, we lobby our congressional members and we write letters to them. We're either thanking them or spanking them. We're either thanking them for supporting progressive legislation or we are spanking them and asking them to support progressive legislation. And if you want to get involved with that, it's a very simple thing. We come up with template letters and you just customize it based on the position of your own congressional representative. If you want to get involved with that, I believe the email is it mikefox@pda.com? Okay, so Mike Fox. Okay, so Mike Fox is the person you want to contact if you want to get involved with that. It's a very simple way to do some volunteerism every month that's super easy. And if you have stage fright and you don't like talking to people, right now we're doing it all virtually. When we're not in COVID-19, we actually print the letters, sign them, and show up to our congressional offices and hand them in person. But obviously we're not doing that right now. Is Dr. Bill on the call?
Can you hear me, Jenna?
I am indeed.
Dr. Bill, can you give us the background and history of PDA and talk to us about Change Makes Change?
Oh, sure. In a nutshell, PDA in a nutshell. So, so let me start with the second, Change Makes Change, and then I'll give you kind of the background of PDA. So, Change Makes Change is, of course, our you know, absolutely a completely open commercial product of progressive Democrats in America, that for a little bit of change out of your pocket, we can collectively all together make real change in America. So that is our sustainer program. And if you go to pdamerica.org, click on donate, and then click on Change Makes Change, you can be one of our sustainers, and that keeps us going every month with a monthly budget that that we can depend on. That then we have a national staff, we have a national database, we have a national website, you know, can send out email blasts, have a social media crew. All of that is sustained by you, our members. We have no dues, so we depend on all of you to donate. And if you could do it on a monthly basis, that's our Change Makes Change program. So please, 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 if you could do that. PDA started in 2004 after the nominee for president then was a not progressive named John Kerry. And we had two candidates at the time who seemed much, much more progressive, Dennis Kucinich and one Howard Dean, who that was before his commercial conversion. So the Dean campaign and the Kucinich campaigns got together and formed PDA. So we started out as a federal PAC that supported federal candidates. Since then, we've developed state PACs like PDA-CA, which is this call is falling under the PDA California State PAC, PDA-CA. But it's since then developed where we can support state and local candidates all across the country. Our goal ultimately is to have a chapter in every congressional district across the country. And that was the vision of our founder, the great Tim Carpenter. So, so we are carrying on with Tim's vision, and I see lots of terrific friends and family of PDA in this room here today. And I want to thank you, Jenna, because you and I both live in Orange County, you in the South, me more in Central Orange County. And we have 7 congressional districts in Orange County. So when I met Jenna Beck, I thought, you know, hey, you would be great to start a South County chapter. I suggested that to her, and she did. And so thank you, Jenna Beck, for stepping up. And if anybody else is interested, if you don't have a chapter of PDA in your area, whatever that is nowadays, it's a little hard to define with the quarantine and everything, but you can contact me or anyone else on the staff. Actually, it's our good friend Dan O'Neill from Phoenix, Arizona, who handles PDA chapter development, but we can help you set up a chapter. It's easy peasy to set up a chapter of PDA if you don't have one in your area. And thank you, everybody, for your involvement, and especially Jenna Beck. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bill. And thank you so much for being a mentor to me as I've been running this chapter over the last couple of years. Now, what I'd like to do, Mike Thaler, are you the chair of PDA-CA? Is that the correct title for you?
I prefer president, since that's what it is.
Okay, so Mike Thaler is the president of PDA-CA, and I want to give you a moment to talk a little bit about PDA-CA specifically, but also the fact that we had to expand the Zoom account for PDA-CA to accommodate all of you today because there was so much interest in this meeting, and also to drop our fundraising link in the chat and talk about how we could use a little bit of some donations, y'all, so that we can cover the cost of expanding this Zoom account, because we are going to be doing these as monthly meetings. I just got selected for this month, and I'm very honored to that my chapter was selected to do this call. But we're going to be doing this moving forward, and so that expansion cost a bit of money for us, and we could really use your help. Go for it, Mike.
Yeah, PDA-CA was formed a couple of years ago, and at the time, it was the only way that the chapters in California, or anywhere for that matter, could work on state level issues, propositions, and candidates. We have a board of about 5 people, and we have a steering committee of quite a few more. And we have been doing endorsements. We have been working on some campaigns on various issues. One of the more recent ones was incarceration especially of refugees. And we've been doing a lot of good, and we plan on a lot more things. And the most recent thing we planned on was doing a periodic, hopefully monthly, statewide chapter meeting on various topics of interest, including fascism. And this is our maiden voyage, so to speak. We've done a few statewide things up until now, but this is the first time it is a chapter meeting. We will probably do one next month, and maybe we'll do one from every month on out if we get the kind of support by you and your requests to do it. And that pretty much sums it up. I will be dropping the link so that you can help pay for this. We originally had a 100 Zoom account. We have 160 people who've registered for this, so we, in a quick hurry, upgraded it to 500. And we ask for your help in paying for it because we don't have dues. So we really are counting on you. So I think that's it. Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you, Mike. And just so y'all know, we are already up to 100 participants on this call. So we have definitely reached where we needed to expand this account. If everybody could just donate like even $10, that would really help us cover the expense. But it's a worthy investment because it gives us the opportunity to bring you this high quality content on a monthly basis. Okay, so we're right now at 4:20. The plan was to start the panel at 4:30. However, I can at this point give it to Alan. If there are things that you want to talk about PDA, if you want to talk about your background, if you want to give the speakers an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk about their backgrounds and then jump in. Basically, the purpose of this meeting is to discuss what Donald Trump is doing right now, the steps that he has taken to indicate that he is planning on challenging the election results if they don't go in his favor, and how we can successfully and peacefully organize so that nobody gets hurt, but we prevent him from staging a coup.
Thank you so much, Jenna. And first of all, thank you for organizing this. Thank you for organizing the chapter. I want to also thank Mike Thaler for all that he does for PDA, of course, Dr. Bill as the state coordinator, and also David Wright, who I spoke to about this event and helped organizing it. But really, thank you so much, Jenna, for taking such initiative on this. I think this is a really great audience to get out. And look, the subject couldn't be more significant. Obviously, Trump is a character who has a lot of his own psychological issues. And so the quirks of his psychology makes predicting his results a little bit, say, more difficult than, you know, trying to negate Mussolini's strategy in Italy in the 1920s and 30s, where there was a lot more ideological consistency and consistency with strategy, which was, you know, brutality. They were bullies and they were in coordination with Italian business interests against socialism at the time. And of course, then the Nazis rose up in Germany and headed towards World War II. What I do think makes this so significant, and I don't think that speaking about fascism as such is out of place. And I should say one thing of importance about my own personal background in relationship to this event is I grew up partly in Italy. And by the way, for some reason, I'm not coming through as the speaker on the interface. I don't know if that's the case for other people, but I apologize if I'm not visible when you have speaker view. Not quite sure.
You appear to be the centerpiece of my screen.
Ah, as you do for me, Jenna, which is nicer than me having to look at me. So that's good. Though you're not, you're just a word right now, Jenna. So still nicer than the mirror reflection I would have with it. But alas, I grew up partly in Italy. And of course, there's a lot of historical overlap and difference between fascism in Italy in the 20s and in the United States right now, even as much as Donald Trump seems to borrow from Benito Mussolini some of his habits when he's speaking. What I think makes it so important is my broad interpretation of the historic moment is that the organizing ideology of the United States of America for the last 4 decades, which is now is becoming increasingly popular as the term neoliberalism to refer to it, is really counter-democratic. It creates such a pulling apart of the middle-class society that existed and that was really built out of the New Deal, the era of a sort of New Deal consensus politics that existed in the United States in the post-war period, where you have wealth really being accumulated in a more concentrated way in the coffers of the investor class, and prospects of attaining a upwardly mobile middle-class society, quote unquote, the American dream, without going into debt servitude. Of course, being in debt servitude is counter to the American dream, becomes more and more difficult for people. And so when you have a situation where elites have more of the wealth concentration and more of the political power concentrated in their hands, the last thing they want is to deal with a nasty thing like popular influence via democracy on who makes the decisions about how society is organized. And so while Donald Trump as an individual character is very troubling, his rise is not that surprising in that context. I think another issue in the domestic United States also is 60 odd years or 55 odd years, depending on how you count it, past the civil rights movement, the United States is faced with the prospect of being, you know, a multiracial democracy, or continuing on a tradition in which communities of color are marginalized in their influence on political decision-making in a society, again, increasingly dominated by rich elites, who to this day remain, of course, disproportionately white Americans. So there are these forces against this becoming an honestly democratic society. And I think these are, at least in the short term, of course, coming to a head with the 2020 election. And Trump, of course, though, and this gets to the more particulars of the moment, has clearly made overtures to his base to resist the result if it looks like it's going against him. And now we find ourselves with some more specific historic analogs, for instance, to 1933 in Germany. And one of the paradoxes of everything I just said, and I'll toss it to introducing the guests in a second, is that we find ourselves in the very paradoxical situation, especially as PDA, the organization which drafted Bernie Sanders to run as a Democrat. In other words, to introduce into the Democratic electoral realm a non-neoliberal politics inside the Democratic Party, that we're supporting neoliberals in this race. And therefore, what we're actually doing is trying to have almost like the coalition that Germany failed to have between the left and the center against the fascists. And so while we have the long-term project of defeating neoliberalism, in the short term, neoliberals in their specific day-to-day, year-to-year, term-to-term politics are not overt enemies of the constitutional republic. And so we actually are very adamant about the need to defeat Donald Trump, even if the immediate people who would be defeating him in this election are the people who throughout their careers have supported the ideology that created this breaking apart of the middle-class social contract, which at least existed for white Americans in the years after World War II. And of course, the hope of progressives was always to make it fully inclusive for all members of American society and to have a healthy democracy here. But I think all of these things are really on the table in this historic moment. And it's very important to take seriously the threat, and the anti-democratic threat, the authoritarian threat, and the sort of 21st century fascist threat of Trumpism. So we have an incredible panel that I can take zero credit for assembling. And I do have to get to the list of the participants again. Bear with me for 1 second. And
if I may for a moment.
Yep.
So just as a reminder for the rest of the participants on the call, if you have questions for the panel, please raise your hand using your participants tab. Alan will be able to see the raised hands and be able to call on you if time is available. And also, please keep yourselves muted during the discussion. Thank you.
And I do think that I have lost the screen. I found it. Here we go. It's an incredible panel, and I can take no credit for assembling. All credit here goes to, I'm not sure, but I imagine first and foremost, Jenna. I know that David Wright was working on bringing this great group of people together. And we have Marjorie Cohn joining us today. And she is the Professor Emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, Deputy Secretary General of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and a member of the advisory board of PDA, PDA-CA, and Veterans for Peace. She's a frequent contributor to Truth Out, and in the email that was sent out, you can see find her latest article on Trump fascism from Truth Out there. We're also going to be joined by Dr. Jose Moreno, who is an activist, Anaheim City Council member, and former co-chair of the Harvard Education Review. Dr. Liam O'Mara, professor of World and Middle East History, and dare I say, congressional candidate challenging longtime Republican incumbent Ken Calvert right here in Southern California. More about that later. Kwasi Nkrumah, a great friend and comrade of mine from around Southern California. He's the co-chair of the MLK Coalition of Greater Los Angeles for Jobs, Justice, and Peace. And finally, by Ray Lutz, an engineer in electronics and software, founder of Citizens Oversight Projects, who fought Blackwater, San Onofre, and is currently fighting for election integrity. And with that, first up, I'm going to call on Marjorie Cohen, who gets to go first for having written an article on Trump fascism, which is so much the subject of this panel. So Marjorie, welcome. Marjorie, are you here, Marjorie? And if so, can you unmute?
Sorry.
There we go. Hi, Marjorie.
Okay.
Great, we can hear you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this program. I love PDA, I love PDA, and just very, very honored to be part of the organization and on the board. I want to just start out with a quote from a Canadian-Scottish politician named T.C. Douglas, who said, "Once more, let me remind you what fascism is. It need not wear a brown shirt or a green shirt. It may even wear a dress shirt. Fascism begins the moment a ruling class, fearing the people may use their political democracy to gain economic democracy, begins to destroy political democracy in order to retain its power and special privilege." And of course, that's what we see Trump doing, mounting a full court press to maintain power legally or illegally at any cost. He has a strategy of undermining confidence in the integrity of the election by screaming voter fraud with no evidence whatsoever and tying voter fraud to mail ballots, because he knows that mail ballots generally go more for Democrats than Republicans. He is insisting that the results be announced on November 3rd, where if more Republicans go to the polls, it may look like he's winning. He has a strategy, I think, to use his media surrogates, including Fox News, to announce him as the winner. I also think that, one of the things that's very, very important is that a lot of people in safe states like California, particularly young people and people on the left, are saying, we don't like Biden, we're in a safe state anyway, I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders, or I'm going to vote for the Green Party, or I'm not going to vote. And my feeling is that the best chance of Biden winning and sustaining that win and actually taking office in January is to have overwhelming numbers in not just the Electoral College, but the popular vote as well. Also, Trump's strategy is to create chaos, which he did in Portland and DC by bringing out his federal thugs to take on protesters and smash their heads. You notice he didn't bring out the military, because he knows, I think, or at least his advisors know, that service members have a duty to obey lawful orders, but they also have a duty to disobey unlawful orders. And many military leaders have said that if they are not, they will resign before they will go into the streets and take on protesters protesting the election. So we have creating chaos, undermining confidence in the outcome of the election, and refusing to denounce not just white supremacy, but QAnon, the army of Trump, which are his so-called poll watchers, every able-bodied man and woman, probably armed with automatic weapons, and his oath keepers, some 50,000 in his army, 25,000 oath keepers. And election challenges, which he has been mounting and the Republicans have been mounting in many different states, and there are several of them pending. There have been a number of them that voter suppression attempts in different states have been successfully challenged at the district court level, which is the trial court level in the federal courts, and then Trump appointed appellate court judges reverse that. And I think what Trump is hoping to do, and he's said that, it's not even surmising, that he wants Amy Coney Barrett, whom I just wrote a piece saying if she joins the court, she'll be the most radical right-winger on the court, even more radical right-wing than the other right-wingers on the court. He wants her in place to decide the election in his favor if it comes to that. Now, unions are talking about mounting a general strike to defend the results of the election. And one of the things I think that we really need to be concerned about is stealing the Electoral College. And that is in states that are run by Republicans, governors or legislatures, not reporting to the Electoral College the results of the popular vote, but rather whoever they want. And if there is not, if no candidate has the 270 electoral votes, once they are officially reported to the Electoral College, then the election goes into the House of Representatives, and we might breathe a sigh of relief and say, whew, the Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives. But it's not a question of the members of the House of Representatives, it's a question of delegations. Each state has one vote, and there are more red states than blue states because the blue states have the large populations, but there are more red states. So that's one of the ways. Majority of Republicans apparently approve stealing the Electoral College this way. So there are many different fronts on which Team Trump is mounting a campaign to steal the election, engineer a coup. He has said in no uncertain terms that he will not accept the results of the election unless he wins. We have our work cut out for us.
Thank you so much. And I suppose the way that we'll proceed is to go from guest to guest. And Marjorie Cohn, can you stay on for a roundtable discussion after the guest speak? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, that'd be fantastic. And hold on one second here. And I believe up next is Dr. Jose Moreno, and take it away.
All right, buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jose Moreno. Over here in the happiest place on earth, or at least a mile away from what's called the happiest place on earth, in a city called Anaheim, in a county called Orange County, where Ronald Reagan famously said, it's where good Republicans go to die, which we now, Dr. Bill, Jenna, and many of us, Danette, began to push. It's where great Democrats come to live. So what I'm hoping to do is to share a few thoughts as briefly as I can on this idea of what it means for me as a council member here in the city of Anaheim as we watch the national landscape of what Donald Trump is saying, and in turn what Republicans are not saying in rebut to him, right? Those who say they're the keepers of our freedoms in these very conservative ways have gone silent on what it means to have free and democratic elections with a small d. I was heartened this morning. I did watch a clip from the Lincoln Project, those Republicans that have created the very political toxicity that we see today, who are now, I think, confessing their sins and regret this Frankenstein that they've created, with support, unfortunately, from some folks on the blue side of the aisle. But they were posed the question, would you be doing the Lincoln Project if it was Bernie Sanders? And they unequivocally said yes, because this is about the whole idea of the American project called democracy, right, in our context, and that they feel Bernie is a fighter for that. And we can't get to our actual ideological arguments when we're within threat of a totalitarian fascist type of takeover of our government. We cannot have the arguments if we're not free. So three areas that I'd like to just briefly touch on as a council member, but I'm also a professor at Cal State Long Beach, what I hear in my students and the fight that we're having here in California around ethnic studies and the importance of ethnic studies to understanding our civic discourse, our civic history, and what might help us combat this othering that fascism depends on for folks who on an everyday basis may not be thinking that they're fascist, but they're contributing and colluding to that process. So first, I'll say fascism needs local collaborators. So I appreciate Jenna being invited to this panel, because I was trying to figure out what can I say to a group of folks at the national level about what the president means to me as a council member about fascism. Well, one thing that we know is, I think as Professor Cohen just mentioned, is that the military has certain safeguards in place. And from everything that I've read of how this may play out, is that Donald Trump will have to depend on local law enforcement, local county sheriffs, local officials, to enact his wishes to undermine our democracy and honor the vote. So in California, at least in Anaheim, we did begin to ask questions of our police department. What happens if Donald Trump decides to send federal unmarked troops or private militarized troops to Anaheim, to Los Angeles, but specifically here, Orange County, to Anaheim, in the way he did in Portland? Who would have to allow permission for that to happen? And for us here in California, it's local city councils are the ones who oversee police departments. We oversee police budgets. We oversee police policies, and whether we're going to collaborate with federal immigration officials or not. And while in California we have Proposition 54, which does not allow our police departments to collaborate or use state resources or public resources to collaborate with federal immigration officials, the concern for us is still these are private militarized officials that are paid by the federal government to avoid perhaps what Professor Cohn mentioned, and then to allow people to simply be taken away by people without having to claim their authority. So we were assured at the local level by our police chief that the city council would have to be apprised if there was any partnership or relationship wherein we were asked, can an agency or a non-city agency come in and enforce laws, right? So that's one thing that for me as a council member, we have to be very, very aware as local people that fascism at the level we're talking about would require local collaboration. So that's where folks who come back to local elections matter. So who's going to be on your city council? Who will oversee to make sure that your police departments are not going to collaborate and collude with a fascist approach to our federal elections? Will be upon us at the local level. Second is voter suppression. Again, for us, we have a county registrar, we have a state attorney general, and we have a state secretary of state. Many of you are familiar that in Orange County, Fresno, and I forget the other county, the third county, California, where Republicans put up these unofficial ballot boxes as a method of suppressing the vote. We're watching very, very carefully to make sure that our local district attorney, that our local registrar does actually enforce our state and federal laws around voting, and certainly supports and pushes the idea of non-intimidation in voting. Orange County famously 20-some years ago did have a local race where actually a former mayor of Anaheim contracted polling guards to basically stand in uniform, a privatized force, security force, to stand in uniform within feet of the polling station to intimidate Latino voters in a high concentrated Latino area. So also we have to be very mindful as local officials about ways that voting is suppressed, not only through the law, but also through local intimidation, and whether our local officials will actually enforce federal and state laws and county ordinances around voting. The second part that I'll say is that fascism needs institutional arrangements to justify itself. And in the United States, as in many societies, we do have an education system where every child is required to attend public schools. So we've now heard Donald Trump talk about the importance of a national curriculum, what he's calling a Patriotic Education Commission, which is looking to inculcate years gone by research, history, knowledge that we know has been debunked, but to reinforce this idea of some national identity based in some form of this manifest destiny, white supremacist, kind of hierarchical, oligarchic form of government. So we have to be very mindful of movements that are happening at the universities and in our K-12 system where we see a privatization of our public education system. It's not simply about dollars, right? We've understood the charter movement, the corporate charter movement, the Trump University as a function of profit, but we must now understand it under this framework of fascism. It's also about taking over curriculum and civics education. And there's a difference between the National Patriotic Education Commission and civics education. And I'll remind us that only 8 states out of 50 actually require civics education in their school systems. So our young people who are getting a public education aren't actually learning the critical tools of what democracy truly is, and then fall into this populism, this false populism of a Donald Trump. And then lastly, I'll say this as a Democrat, that fascism also depends on partisan self-interest. And I'll caution us, I think as was done earlier, that the idea that we have to vote for Trump because he's the lesser of all evils, that means we're negotiating with some evil somewhere. And so we have to be very mindful, that in the very ways we're concerned about fascism and let's all vote blue to make sure fascism doesn't come in, we're acting in a fascist way by telling people how they're supposed to vote, how they're supposed to think, and how dare you question the ticket because now you're threatening our ability to beat the fascist. That's what fascism does. It builds on itself. So we have to be very mindful of that, vote with commitment and passion towards the present, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, but be mindful that we ourselves often engage in practices in the name of democracy that actually start to look and sound a lot like the very thing we're trying to get rid of. And that's what our country fell into in our revolution, if you all remember. So I'll end with that and welcome any questions and comments or tomatoes that you want to throw at me. So looking forward to the conversation.
I have the cruelest tomato to throw at you, which is I thought that was so brilliant. I think we should get Jose Moreno on the short list of people to become the next U.S. Senator from California. I think that would be brilliant.
Alan, we've been working on him for sure. We definitely want him to run for Congress. But I do have a quick question for you. Do you want to hold questions until after you have each speaker speak, or we do have a hand up?
I see that. Yes, no, I think we will. In fact, I was planning on the sort of standard format of everybody on the panel gets to speak, and then they go a very quick round where they get to maybe cross dialogue and have a follow-up thought, and then we go to questions from the audience. So I see Jonathan Adler has his hand up. I should have outlined this earlier. And so just you're top of the queue there, but everybody should jump in and get in on the queue for later. And after that quick round of where people can comment on each of the panelists' comments, maybe one response each, then we'll go to questions from the audience. And Jose Moreno, I just want to say again, that is just a brilliant presentation. Of course, you've taken much of American history and even extending out to global considerations from a local platform of being on the Anaheim City Council, and it just goes to show we got to encourage everybody to get involved in politics at every level that they can. And thank you so much for that presentation. Up next is a man who is running for the U.S. Congress. And again, I should go out to the non-speaker view and to make sure that Liam is here. He's a man who I ran into on the David Feldman podcast radio show a little while ago. And since that time, I'm very proud to announce that Liam O'Mara is endorsed by Progressive Democrats of America nationally. And I was super impressed at him once I was on that show, very briefly overlapping with him. And I think you're all, if you haven't heard him yet, are about to be impressed with an exceptional progressive champion who is running for U.S. Congress against incumbent Ken Calvert. And I am going to place, since PDA has endorsed Liam nationally, I'm going to place a link into the chat room through which people can donate to Liam's campaign to be a Democratic member of the U.S. House of Representatives from California. And you can choose whatever percent you want to hand off to PDA, though at least 50% of it will go to Liam O'Mara. It can be more than that, it can be 100%. So read the details and donate as you like. One quick thing, Michael Goldman, and he's come up twice, you asked about Eric Prince. Eric Prince, if people don't know, since this does go to what Jose was talking about a little bit, and the idea of private armies, he was the person who founded Blackwater. People don't know this about Eric Prince, but on the days before the 2016 election, he got on to national radio and he advocated for the idea that the Hillary Clinton emails showed all sorts of things that they really didn't show, that he had the inside information. So if anybody thinks Michael Prince might really be somebody willing to be active for Donald Trump, yes, I think that is a very real worry. Liam O'Mara, take it away.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
Okay, so hello, yeah, I'm Liam O'Mara. I am the congressional candidate for the 42nd in Southwest Riverside County. I won't say much about the campaign since Alan was kind enough to introduce it, but this district absolutely is flippable, and polls are already showing that we are closest to do it of anybody in the last 20 years. So please do consider donating and supporting our movement here. But in my day job, I'm a historian of ideas, and populist, nationalist, and fascist movements are one of my areas of expertise and something that I've lectured on for many years. Now, if anyone's interested in my definitional sketch of neo-fascism and how it basically works, I have a video up that I cobbled together from some different classroom lectures that lay out the 9 core characteristics. And there's like a little article I did and put up on Down with Tyranny that does the same thing. So I won't really spend time discussing as much what neo-fascism is here. I want to talk more about what made it possible and what has really sort of enabled Trump. Because I'll tell you unequivocally, Trump's movement and Trumpism is neo-fascist. But this has been a difficult one for a lot of scholars in this subject area to recognize. And I think one of the reasons for that is that all previous fascist movements have depended upon some kind of major crisis. There's been something that precipitated it, that made people more receptive to right populist arguments. And a lot of people just didn't see that. They were like, oh, well, everything's fine under Obama's economy. And I think Alan touched on this at the very beginning. And we really do need to recognize the relationship between neoliberal economics and the rise of neo-fascism in this country. Because, you know, the truth is the real economy has been in steady decline for 40 years, more than 40 years. Wage growth has been flat, but costs have risen across the board, notably healthcare, housing, education. As a consequence, consumer debt has exploded, and the bottom 50% of this country have lost $1 trillion in wealth since the late 80s. I mean, so the stock market looks good. We have more than 600 billionaires now. And, you know, there's you know, there was pretty strong job growth under like, you know, Clinton and Obama, but job growth where the jobs don't pay a living wage doesn't really matter for the real economy, because the real economy is the circulation of cash from person to person here. That's the important part. If you're just not making enough money, it doesn't matter how many jobs there are. And the stock market is 90% speculation now, so it's not really relevant. Now, as far as what really makes Trumpism different, because we do have to recognize that this has been building for quite some time. This did not come out of left field. There are a lot of people, myself included, that have been sounding alarm bells about this for a long time. And in fact, I started talking about this and posting about this in 2015 when Trump announced, because of the way he was approaching things. We've been experimenting with like neo-fascist rhetoric since the 60s at least, and it's gone mainstream since the 80s. I mean, everything from Nixon's Southern strategy to Reagan's dog whistles about welfare queens, the worship of the military machine, the anti-union rhetoric during the Cold War, the scapegoating of immigrants and trade deals, attacks on the media and on academia, sort of suggesting that it doesn't really matter what we say, it's just colleges are indoctrination factories. All of this has been priming the Republican electorate for neo-fascism. What's different with Trump relative to previous leaders of the Republican Party is that they would make veiled references to these movements, but still try to appeal to a more mainstream centrist sensibility. With Trump, the mask is completely off, and he's depending entirely on that right populist base. The result of that is that he is more popular among the Republican voters than any president since we started polling this thing. He's more popular than Reagan ever was. So they love him. A lot of other ordinary Americans are a lot more skeptical. But for neo-fascists to take power and actually subvert democratic systems has never, ever taken a majority. It's always been a hardcore movement behind it, and Trump is assembling that. So we do have to be aware of that. And I really, and one of the things one of the reasons that I love progressive Democrats of America is that we really do need to push back against the liberal side of this as well. I mean, because liberals have historically failed every time to actually stop the rise of fascist movements. Did we stop the rise of an oligarchy in America and the concentration of wealth? Did we stop the creation of a media monopoly that blinds most Americans to the state of the real economy? Because the news is certainly not telling us the economy sucks. I mean, did we stop the education system from, and as Jose brought up, the question of like civics and civics education, right? When only 9 states even mandate this anymore, instead of the equivalent of a couple of years of it that you used to get in high schools, poll after poll is showing that a huge chunk of the American population has zero idea how the US government even works. And we've gone from, you go back to like 1990, and it's 1 in 16 people would support a military government or the army running the country. And it's 1 in 5 now. You know, and many polls are showing that up to 1/3 of the population would support a military coup and direct military rule. And that is terrifying to me. What we're heading for at best is a kind of managed democracy like you have in, like, you know, Russia, you know, Iran, Turkey, you know, other states where you have formal elections, but a tiny elite actually maintains most of the power. But we do still have a voice, and we need to raise it, and we need to use it. And there's a lot of reasons that I would take, that I take at least some comfort in seeing more people active and more people involved now. Voter turnout has been very high so far among like the Democratic coalition. So that gives me at least some hope. And one thing that we actually also can rely on is all previous fascist movements. They've always failed to come up with an effective succession mechanism, like who is the next leader. So if Trump is we do manage to push him out, you know, it will be difficult for someone to sort of reassemble that coalition, but it's possible. And that's the thing that should really terrify us. It's not about Trump. And if we keep focusing and fixating on Trump, we're missing the real subject here. If we don't deal with the real issues in the American economy that have made Trumpism viable, we will get someone worse than Trump. You know, and if that person is more competent than Trump, we're in real trouble. So that's where I'll end here. But again, you know, I'm running for Congress, so support the campaign.
Well, look, Liam very graciously did not campaign in his presentation. Allow me again for just 60 seconds to campaign a little bit on his behalf. Just by saying, wow, to have a voice like that in US Congress, with that kind of historical knowledge, the understanding of the trajectory of American society over the last 75 years, particularly the last 40 that he pointed out, it will be so tremendous to have such a powerful, you know, rooted in a deep understanding of history, progressive champion in Congress. So once again, I'll add into the link a way that people can donate to a campaign that has a really good shot at expanding the Democratic majority, and most importantly, expanding the number of true progressives, because we do need a new transformative political economics inside America that was introduced to the country through the Bernie Sanders campaign 2016-2020. PDA proudly had a big role in that, and they're very popular politics right now. We need champions who are elected officials. Thank you so much, Liam, and we'll hear more from him in a little while. Up next is somebody I'm very honored to introduce, Kwasi Nkrumah, who I have known for years from around Southern California, an absolutely brilliant grassroots activist who, just like Liam, his politics go expanding all the way out to the entire globe and the consideration of all of humanity. So from the world to the country to the local, very honored to introduce Kwasi Nkrumah.
Thank you, Alan, and I'd like to thank Jenna and others for inviting me to participate. Yeah, I think it's really very essential, and it would be quite foolish not to discuss openly the problem and the threat of fascism in our current circumstances, and not fundamentally about Trump. Can you?
Might be helpful if you, you look great and your backdrop is great, but it might be helpful if you kill your video image because your audio is breaking up, and of course what's essential is the audio for people to hear right now.
Okay, so what do I need to do?
Well, right now we can hear you again. Why don't you give it a go for a minute, and if it breaks up again, I'll let you know.
Okay. Yeah, I think that what Liam said about Trump is very important. It's not really about Trump. You see, Trump did not create the movement that is behind him. He has stepped in a very opportunistic way to take advantage of a movement which has been building for over the past 40 to 50 years. It takes us back to another national election, which was 1968. in 1968, George Wallace stepped out of the Deep South, stepped out of his segregationist corner and began to promote a right-wing populism, which was essentially racist, but which was designed to appeal to a much broader audience. Ever since that, and it was George Wallace who raised the fundamental slogan, which became the byword of American politics ever since then, law and order. Richard Nixon picked up the law and order slogan from George Wallace's campaign and used it to carry himself through the White House. But that year of 1968, a lot of the discussion was whether George Wallace was actually going to take the White House because he had so much support everywhere he went, particularly in blue-collar working class communities all across the North, the Midwest, and all these other regions that were not part of his traditional battleground. The net result of that, aside from introducing a particular kind of conservatism into national politics, was that many of the extreme right-wing groups, which were not anything more than very, very marginal, began to look at what George Wallace had done in 1968 and began to say, this is how we have to operate from now on. And since that time, they've been working very hard to mainstream their politics and make it possible for them to come out of their corner and challenge all of the basic changes which were taking place in the 1960s. The attacks on affirmative action, a lot of the even violent movements in places like Boston when school integration was introduced there as policy, in the 1970s and early 80s. All of these things have been percolating for quite some time, and meanwhile, these extreme right-wing groupings, as I said, have been really studying and working to mainstream their politics. They have gone into the Republican Party, used it as a front to expand their political influence everywhere from the White House to the Supreme Court, but more importantly, in grassroots communities throughout the United States. And they've done this largely quietly, not with street actions, not with a lot of overt activity that could be that publicly identified, but very, very quietly, they've been building a mass base of support for their politics and social outlook for many decades now. There's a book called The Beast Reawakens by Martin A. Lee, which came out in the mid-90s, in which he documented how these extreme right-wing groups from the United States have been networking with the remnants of the Nazi Party in Europe and other right-wing movements in Europe and other countries who were tutoring them on how to build a mass-based movement and how to make it possible to win if not a majority, a significant enough minority of the American population to be able to move the entire body politic in this country. And that is what they have successfully done over the past 4 decades. Trump has come in kind of as an opportunist and taken advantage of that. But the real problem is that there is a mass conservative base. In the 80s, there was a lot of discussion about the rise of these extreme right-wing fundamentalist religious movements and how they were spreading all over the country. A writer named Sarah Diamond has documented the history of that very well. Recently, a book called Red State Christians, Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump, has traced the history of that and the fact that Trump's, which I think most of us are aware, Trump's rock solid base of support is in the fundamentalist religious communities. These folks are not they're fairly impervious to rational arguments. They are fairly impervious to progressive political platforms, etc. And they are the ones who are unswervingly supportive of Donald Trump today. in spite of the fact that in terms of what their their professed value systems are about, he is the exact opposite of most of it. So we have a very serious situation. I mean, and when we study how fascism actually developed in Germany in particular, we can see a lot of parallels between the evolution of the Nazi movement and its growth in Weimar Germany to the growth of these very widespread right-wing movements in the United States, and its culmination in what is the fight that's going on in Washington right now. And yes, we're in a very dangerous situation as to whether or not democracy is going to continue in this country. And the thing that we have to realize about fascism is that these folks they engage in the established politics of the system in order to take a wrecking ball to that system. They do not see themselves confined within the parameters of how the game is usually played. In fact, they don't really care about that at all. They want to do away with how the game is played, and they do, in fact, as I think Leon and several others mentioned, they want to do away with democracy, frankly. And so, you know, it's important for us to know the ground that we're fighting on and who we're fighting. And I think that we have to do a lot more closer examination of how this developed in other countries. We need to look at how it developed actually in the Deep South in this country right after the Civil War, and the fact that in the 1920s and early 30s, the Ku Klux Klan became the broadest social movement in white communities in the United States. And it was only because their internal cohesion imploded in the late 20s and early 30s that they did not become a much more powerful factor during the Great Depression. And the fact that at that time, there were progressives on the scene who did take the initiative and who did get down at a grassroots level and begin to really organize working people who were suffering, minority communities who were suffering. They began to really build actually a mass progressive movement in that time that really was the engine behind the New Deal, the positive changes that took place in electoral politics and the whole scene during that period. But we need to really recognize also that in the period just preceding that, it was an extremely right-wing, racist, and in many respects, pro-fascist movement, the KKK, which was the dominant social movement in the United States. So, you know, there's a history behind this. There's a recent history, and there's a history that extends backward. And we really have to start looking at this seriously and not put ourselves in the position of living in a fool's paradise. You know, our culture seems to tend to rock us to sleep over many unpleasant issues and difficult issues that it isn't very edifying to even contemplate. But we really need to become much better informed and understanding of the dynamics of this, you know, in terms of this thing about fascism and crisis, as Liam did point out correctly. Really, the crisis has been going on for some time. You know, I come out of basic industry. I used to be a rank and file activist in the Steelworkers Union. I came out of what is now the Rust Belt before I moved to California. And we have millions of people who have been permanently displaced out of any viable position in the economy, and not all of them are poor Black people. A lot of them are white working class people who are now working 3 jobs to make less than they did when they had 1 good job and a union. So we have a tremendous amount of work to do, and hopefully, people will do what they did after Trump got elected, and the women's marches and so forth erupted, which was a great surprise to me as an activist and a wonderful thing. We need more of that, and hopefully that is what will happen at the polls this year. I mean, I don't know what more people have put in their face to know that we're in a dangerous situation that something needs to be done about. And the first step in that is to give Donald Trump his walking papers and get his hands off of the apparatus of the state. So I want to appreciate everybody who's involved in activity to try to bring that change about. I'm not a Democrat myself. I've been an independent my entire adult life, and I intend to stay that way. But we need to recognize each other and understand that our labels and some of the boundaries that we work in are not the defining issue before us today. The defining issue is how to save ourselves and save our society from a totalitarian takeover, which is staring us in the face right now.
I gotta give a pause so we all can do shelter in place standing ovation. That was absolutely brilliant, Kwasi. Ray Lutz is up next. I don't envy you, sir, to have to follow Kwasi. That was phenomenal, Kwasi. Thank you again. Really just incredible synthesis of so many things there. And again, great historic framing. And Ray Lutz, you are up.
Well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate this great bunch of people that have been assembled. And thank you very much for asking me to come to this. Now, for about the past 15 years, I and Citizens Oversight, which is the nonprofit I founded, have been working to understand the technical aspects of elections and to figure out the best way to provide oversight. So what we're concerned about this time is that Trump may not win the election, but he still may be able to win it anyway. And so we've got to make sure that we're doing things to stop those other avenues. People get very sometimes, looking at the polls, we can win, we're already winning, we don't have to vote, this sort of thing. I don't think that's going to happen as much this time as it did last time, but still there are things that could happen. Now, the difference between what my talk is going to be about and what you've heard before is I'm going to talk more about exactly what we can do with boots on the ground, activist activities that we can do in this election right away. The primary mission of Citizens Oversight is basically to engage public officials directly. We found this was the best way to make a big effect. We stopped having so many meetings where we just talked about philosophy, and we started with every meeting sending emails and actually engaging with people each time. So we started having a lot more impact when we did that. Now we started getting involved in these audits. So every election in California, they have nice audits, but in the rest of the states, they don't so much have these nice audits. The audits is where they take a sample of ballots and actually count them up and compare with the official results, but it's the officials doing it. So the officials are auditing themselves. It's like asking someone who's speeding on the freeway to pull over and give themselves a ticket. Not going to happen too often. But if you're there watching them, then you can force them to, face the music if there's something wrong. Now, just a bit of history. In the 2016 primary, Citizens Oversight sued San Diego for leaving out 285,000 ballots out of the audit that they were supposed to include. We won. But then Alex Padilla and his friends in LA and other places changed the law to make it allowable to leave them out. Any of the later vote by mail ballots now can be left out. And in this election with maybe 90% of California voting by mail and maybe a majority of them left out. But this year, even though we're going to be focused on these audits, we're looking at the top 11 critical states, which are not California. And the top counties in those states are representing about 80% of the voters in the state. And so we've got 237 key counties that we need to provide oversight to. They're not California, so that makes it difficult if we're talking mostly to California people, which I think we are today. So we have two technologies I'm going to briefly describe to you here. One is called Audit Engine and the other one is called Crowdwatch. I think Crowdwatch is going to be something that we can really get on board with a group like yours. And Audit Engine, I just want you to know about. So as I mentioned, a lot of these states do their own self-audits. We have to watch those. But we've recently came to the realization that we can't trust the officials to do their own audits, and it would be great if we could get a hold of the ballot images that are now being made by the voting systems that have now evolved to do that. So when you go into most of the polling places, they have a little voting machine there. People put their ballots in, and nowadays it shoots a picture of the ballot, stores it in memory. And that's the image that we want to, it's just like a picture of JPEG that you would see on your computer. Very high quality sometimes. And we want to take a look at these pictures later, as long as three things happen. Number one, they have to actually save the picture and not delete them. Number two, we have to be able to, well, have equipment that makes it. That's number one. Fortunately, now more than 99% of the equipment in these 237 counties do use that type of equipment. So we're past that threshold. Second one is they have to not delete them, and many states have a rule that they just delete them. And so there's been lawsuits trying to get them saved. In California, they're not going to be allowed to be deleted. Other states have, in Florida, it's sort of up in the air. And thirdly, we have to be able to get at them. That's the hard part, because if it's a state that's run by the GOP, they don't want us to get at the images. Now, what does Audit Engine do? Essentially, it is a cloud-based system. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail on it. It isn't the kind of thing that we can have, you know, loads of volunteers help us, except for getting the ballot images, of course, promoting the idea of saving the ballot images and so forth. But then it takes some fairly sophisticated technology-oriented people that know about the system to be able to run them. In this election, we're hoping to be able to run, and this is a brand new, like launching a Mercury space capsule. We've never had this kind of technology on our side. Okay, so this is like, maybe if we can get the top 20 of the most critical things, if we can do 20 audits this way, I think it would be a huge success this year. Now, I'm going to switch over to this new thing that we just got started on and we're just now gotten available, which is called Crowdwatch. Crowdwatch is a tool that helps us deploy volunteers into the field and gather information that we need, attend meetings, and work as a crowd, work as a group, if you will, to process that information and find out key things that are happening. So what we have is we have a way to upload watch points, which are going to be a place, a time, a date when they should be there to watch something. And then they bring their cell phone. Everybody seems to have these days. They take pictures, videos, and notes and answer questions that are appropriate for the watch point. That gets uploaded to the server, and then we have a crowd-based reviewers that look it over and match things up and process the data. So we're looking initially to do the polling tape project. Here's the thing. These poll tapes are put out on the polling places in many places at the end of election night. Those represent the totals from that polling place if they have a machine that totals them up at the precinct. If we can, so gather those and then check them against the official numbers. And if we find something, this gives us a foot in the door to file a judicial challenge to anything that's going on in those states. Otherwise, in a state like Florida, they have a fairly tight window for completing the election. I think it's 17 days after the election, it has to be certified, and then we only have 10 days to challenge it. And so, you know, it isn't enough time to get ballot images or do anything else. So we need to get these something so that we can stop something from going on there that might happen that would be ugly. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen. You know, it's going to boil down probably to a few top states that are really, really critical that we have to really, really take a shot at. So the people out in the field, for example, in this case, just to give you an idea of how this works, They'll be taking their smartphone. They ask for the nearest watch point. It directs them to the polling place. They then, at the right time, get the snapshot of the polling tape. It converts it into text so their machine can understand it, and uploads it onto the server. People can then help us review that, and that's where you come in. You can be sitting at your machine helping us with Crowdwatch anywhere you are. Now, so our goal there is to find discontinuities in these poll tapes, but this system can be used for many other things. For example, we have the full list of all the drop boxes in these critical states. So we want people to go to the drop boxes, take pictures, see if there's intimidation, see what the situation is at the drop boxes. There's somebody hanging around, or keeps coming there in a white van and dropping off hundreds of ballots. That would be of interest. Trump on the back, probably. You know, as are people walking around with AR-15s, intimidating people. Anything like this. This could also be possibly used for weeding out bad apples from the police departments. If there's something going on, protests or something, we want to get people there with their smartphones. This is a nonviolent Antifa, if you will, of trying to combat the white supremacy movement. We're not going to be carrying around guns or going after them with violence, but transparency is better than that. So this is kind of the thing that we're working on. So it's now just getting available in the Android and phone app. We're going to be announcing it. But what I'll do is I'll put some more information and some links about this stuff for you to find out more about these specific actions that we can take to try to stop this. But let me just say one more thing. The key is, of course, this pre-election observation that we need to do, because the ballot image auditing and the audits and so forth, they handle it only after the ballots have been cast, and all of these other scams have now stopped. So that's why with Crowdwatch, we can start this hopefully right away. I'm so sorry that we didn't start this so much sooner, but we just didn't know, we didn't have the idea back then. So we're working with other groups to try to pool this data and make sure that that we can all put it together, and because it's such a big project. Basically, we need to cover about 1,200 precincts kind of evenly across these states. So we need at least 1,200 volunteers across these various states to help us out. Not, one volunteer can maybe do a few of them, but also it's not going to be a perfect distribution. So that's the challenge for the poll tapes. And the other observation that I'm talking about. So I'll just put those links in, and then you can contact me and find out more. There's a sign up thing for volunteers as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray Lutz, and everybody should look out for all that information to the chat, right? And also, I suppose you can also share that with Jenna going forward. Jenna, if you can collect that up and make it available to people too, if that sounds okay, Jenna.
Yes,
thank you.
I'll work with Mike Fowler. I don't have control over this particular Zoom meeting, but Mike has, he will get a copy of the whole chat. So I'll get whatever links are dropped into the chat, I will get them and I can share them later.
Thank you. Let's go quickly through just sort of a whip around, maybe 2 minutes each to all the panelists. I know Marjorie Cohn, you're going to have a lot of large questions that were put into the chat, but we can address those later. Just your reflections after hearing your other 4 panelists and their presentations. Marjorie. Marjorie, are you muted?
Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah. I had said how important it is for people, even in California, a safe state, to vote for Biden, to get the popular vote numbers up to make it more difficult for Trump to be challenging the results. And I know there's some pushback against that. I've seen it in the chat, and I've seen it on the left. I've seen it among my kids who are millennials, and I'm reminded of the words of Angela Davis, who about 2 weeks ago was honored by my organization, the National Lawyers Guild, with an award. And she said, yes, and she said, we don't vote for the best candidate, we vote for the candidate who is most susceptible to pressure. And I think that's a really good way to frame it. We get Trump out, we get Biden in, and then we hold his feet to the fire. There is no doubt that he is a weak candidate. All of us agree with that. I was a Bernie supporter all the way, 2016, 2020 as well. But we really need to stop the bleeding. And I think nobody's mentioned the pandemic or the economy in conjunction with the pandemic. I call it the plague, which Trump has not just mismanaged, but criminally made worse. Not just manslaughter for all the people who have died on his watch. He knew back in March or April how deadly it was. But there's a theory. I'm a criminal defense attorney of second-degree murder. You don't need intent to kill. You need conscious disregard of a high-degree risk of death. And I think that what's happening, and the reason that people are going to the polls in droves, and not going to the going to the polls in droves. In Georgia, they're standing in line for 10 hours. People are doing all kinds of things to make their votes count. Is that people are dying, people are getting sick, and Trump is flouting this pandemic. He had it himself. He had the COVID. He's not out of the woods yet, probably, but yet he's still walking around without a mask and encouraging his followers not to follow the precautions. And that has had, of course, vast ramifications in the economy. And so I think that we need to be talking about that, but people know that. We don't need to tell them that. But I do think that it's important to get these voters who think that they can vote for whoever they want because we're in a safe state. Again, we need to get those numbers up. And I really appreciate all the other speakers. I've just learned a tremendous amount. And so I really appreciate being part of this.
Thank you so much. And again, we'll be taking questions from the audience members. And there was a long question from Marjorie that was in the chat, and I'll bring that up too from the person who introduced that. Dr. Jose Moreno, you're up. Your thoughts?
Just a quick couple of them. I put one in the chat room. I agree with everything Professor Cohn said. And one of the ways I've heard the quote as well is that, that at least Biden allows us to live another day. To fight another day in this democracy, and so it means a lot of work. What I worry about is the idea of normal. I worry about the idea of what we learned from the Obama election is we had an African-American president elected, that's it, we're all good, and everybody kind of went back and went into their own deals and forgot that we needed to sustain that work. That was one step forward. It wasn't the end of the journey. So I worry that we're telling Latinos, that we're telling young people that they have to vote like as if their lives depend on it, which they do. And when they do come to vote, and hopefully will win, that then what happens on Monday? They're going to expect certain policies. They're going to expect certain budgets. They're going to expect a lot of things to shift. And if they don't, I worry then about a retrieval, a retreat back. So I worry about that. So we have to keep ourselves mindful of that. Second, I do worry. I'm glad Professor Cohn brought up the pandemic. Well, most of us, if you're not, you should be familiar with Naomi Klein's work on the shock doctrine. I do worry that a Biden administration will fall into a shock doctrine of austerity economics. We're seeing it already with Democrats in California who will not pass a new bill to fund and in fact suspended our governor Newsom, a progressive Democrat's what he's called, suspended a commission for healthcare for all in California in the midst of a pandemic when we need it most. So I worry about that, but I'm hopeful and cautiously optimistic that when we win, that we will understand how critical the local infrastructure is. Kwasi, your presentation just reminded me of how the Trump era exists because of 40 years of building by the Republican corporate infrastructure to get people on school boards, on city councils, local supervisors, then became Congress people, and now they've appointed federal judges. So I worry about the future, even with a progressive legislative push, a lot of the laws that we may get through Biden and Kamala will just be struck down by the courts. So, so again, I think that the idea of staying local, staying focused to protect our most vulnerable is going to be essential for us moving forward, whether it's Biden or Trump.
Thank you so much, Jose Moreno. And up next is Liam O'Mara. Take it away, Liam.
All right, so first I want to just thank everyone for inviting me to this. This was great. I've learned a lot too, and really appreciate the perspectives of the other panelists. I think that these are really important conversations to have. And we need, I mean, we have to get back to, in some sense, educating the electorate, talking about things. We used to be able to depend upon the media to do a better job of that, and a lot of politicians to do a better job of that. And these days, most politicians just seem to be like waiting to see what comes up as popular in their focus groups and taking their cues there instead of actually leading on issues. And the media is certainly no longer really serving the role that we need it to in this country. I want to just, in terms of all these discussions around Biden, and you know, Marjorie brought up some of this stuff, and as well Jose about the keeping up pressure on a potential Biden administration. We do need to kind of rally around this. There's a couple of problems here. First off, fear is not a great motivator for our side of the aisle here, just psychologically speaking. So telling people they have to vote for Biden because Trump is terrible, honestly, just does not work well. We have to win on the issues, and we have to convince people that we can get things done. And one way to do that is to really emphasize the progressive policies. Clinton was a whole lot more palatable to me because of Bernie's movement and the platform that was forced upon that campaign. If we can keep up the pressure there, we can keep a Biden campaign as a little bit more progressive than it is, but his instincts are not good for us, and it will push us in the wrong direction. But realistically, it's the best shot we've got, because the kind of protest movements that we're seeing now and would need to continue seeing there, under a Trump administration, they play into his hands. He's consciously inviting them. All the rhetoric around Antifa and BLM, my own incumbent is doing this. He seems to be running almost entirely on anti-BLM rhetoric. All of it plays into their hands because it lets them manipulate the fear of their base. That's how Nixon was elected. You know, the protests in the 60s led a select section of the middle of the electorate to go for the law and order candidate. And that honestly terrifies me. A lot of people will choose that law and order candidate out of a sense of fear. We do need to be cognizant of that. We need Biden so that we can actually protest and not be worried about a military takeover of this country. So that's my rationale, at least. And I'll pass it on to the next person.
Thank you so much, Liam. Again, I keep dropping in to the chat ways that people can support Liam's campaign in the 42nd District, running against reactionary Republican, longtime incumbent Ken Calvert. Quasi, you're up next. Take it away.
Okay, I think it's really essential to challenge people at large, average people, to realize that they have to be the real source of change. If anything is going to improve in this country, the average person has got to get the idea in their head once again that they have a role to play, that they can change things, and they can determine the political direction and the economic direction and the other directions of our society. But they have to realize that that is their role and that it's their responsibility to do so. Earlier speakers spoke about how civics isn't really taught in the public schools anymore. And, you know, that's very true. The average person knows very little about how our political system works. They don't learn the ABCs of this as people used to when I was in school. When I was in elementary school, they taught all of this stuff. Right. Now, people just really don't know. And their sense of disempowerment, and there also some of the consumer mentality. I mean, we consume politicians like we consume other things. We expect someone else to take care of all of our problems. And we think that there'll be some instant solution. And if there isn't, we just kind of throw up our hands. This is a very strong tendency in this country today. And I think as we talk to people about what's going on in Washington, as we talk to people about changing what's going on, we must talk to them about reconceiving their own role in this entire process. Finally, I just want to, I have done some studies on these questions about where right-wing movements lead to and the rise of fascism for a long time. But I was fortunate a couple of years ago to come across a couple of really, really excellent documentaries that were readily available, in this case on Amazon. One is called Hitler and the Nazis. I really would recommend everybody to try to get your hands on this and pass it along to other people. Also, there's another one called The Rise of the Nazi Party. These documentaries are really, really excellent. They will give you a short course on all of the basic essentials of what we're talking about and really how these things develop. I mean, and I think they can go a long way to opening people's eyes to things that are confusing them right now. And that is a big part of what we've got to do, is unconfuse people about issues such as should they vote or not. We really have to challenge people on this and in a way that makes them really begin to look at themselves and toward themselves as what role they're playing in the solution of these problems that are going to impact and are impacting all of us.
Thank you so much, Quasi. And now, Ray, you're up, and then we'll go to questions from the audience and also to, I believe, Art's long question in the chat. But go ahead.
Okay, well, I just want to make a couple of comments based on what we just heard. Coronavirus and the pandemic. This is really kind of getting in the way of oversight, people going into the offices. And so what we've been doing right now is harvesting security camera links and other kinds of virtual assets that we're going to be compiling so that people can help you know, provide oversight. It's really not that great of oversight because the security cameras are usually low resolution and the like. But it's better than nothing, and the fact that we're asking for it is even the first step. One of the things that was brought up was, I think Marjorie was saying, we're going to have to, and this is what we found with citizens oversight. We had the most productive actions when we engaged with the elected officials directly. That is, we stopped thinking about once we voted, then you know, we kind of could just be disgusted, but that was all we could do, and cry on each other's shoulders in meetings with each other. And instead, we were actively going to meetings and saying no at the right time. And this is why we got involved. Our very first thing that we did was fighting Blackwater's expansion within San Diego was the first thing that we came across. Of course, that was led by Eric Prince, you know, the brother of Betsy DeVos, who's the pathetic education secretary, and a component of Trump's administration in a way. So anyway, this is what I'd like to suggest that we think about is we're going to have to continue, because think about what's going to happen. Even if it's successful when we get Biden in, we're going to have to hold their feet to the fire. There's going to be a counter to everything. We saw this with the healthcare, what seemed like a very reasonable thing to do. Let's have a healthcare policy. Then we had healthcare protests. We don't want any healthcare, blah, blah, blah. And so it was ongoing. So we're going to have to really continue to engage after the election. One little tip I just want to say, the most psychologically active image they found, maybe not the most, but it's one of the most, is a pair of eyes. What they found was they could, at the, like a honor system coffee nook, photocopy some eyes, paste it up on the wall, and donations went up by 3 times just by having those eyes there. So eyes in the room. You know, if you have people in the room, even if they're not seeing anything, is so important. And almost none of these in local meetings have anyone there. There's sometimes city council, but you look at all of it, you can't even list all the different departments that we have. People are not really attending to their democracy. They don't know how to do it. They haven't been trained. If we could just get one person out of 1,000 to really engage that way, we really would have the ability to turn something around. So I just wanted to put in my 2 cents in terms of looking at, we're going to have to work really hard on this election. I think it's going to come down to some court proceedings and shenanigans, and I hope not, but I hope it's a landslide, so there's no way around it. But if it happens, we got to be ready to do that, because this country is never going to be the same if this goes down the way into Trump's hands.
Thank you so much, Ray. And we're going to go to audience questions. But I suppose I'm just going to chime in, and it's just something I find myself just for today, really, for the first time thinking about. Because, of course, like I imagine so many of the people on the call, and certainly the panelists, we have all been thinking about since Trump's election, the relationship of our democratic republic, constitutional democracy, again, with all of its serious flaws, some of them that have been exaggerated over the past 4 decades, and of course, many which go back to the founding and even before. How rarely the example of actually Roman Empire and the Roman Republic is brought up. And which undoubtedly would have been something that I think people in mid-20th century Europe would have thought back to. But in the context of the United States, it does seem to also have considerable relevance because, we don't tend to think of it even among the radical left and the progressive left that we are a global empire. This country has military bases around the world. And of course, in the example of Rome, the Republic was the period, it wasn't a democratic republic, right? But it did have a more distributed conception of power than what followed in the 3 centuries later. It was in the Roman Republican era in which the huge conquest of Rome occurred around the Mediterranean and then beyond. And then the Republic was overthrown in a period in which there was, leading up to that period, some demands for some more popular power. And then you had the emperors for 3 centuries after that. So there's a republic up until Julius Caesar, and then there's a battle among the triumvirate, and it settles into a complete, domination of a kind of monarchic rule. And so, elites throughout human history, and when considering the maintenance of empire, certainly really would, large portions of them are always happy to shrug off any kind of popular interference with politics and democratic rule. And there is that model of an empire that then thrived as an empire for 3 centuries after the republic was overthrown and an imperial governance structure was put in place. So yes, I really appreciate all of the insights. Of course, really also appreciate all that Ray is bringing into this conversation as well, which is of course practical and pragmatic at a point of true necessity. But again, I'm surprised sometimes how little Rome comes up in this. And of course, we are an empire. And so that paradigm also is a very worrying paradigm to think about as well, and the way in which that may bounce around the imagination of some of our contemporary elites too. Up first is Jonathan Adler. And Jonathan, you have the floor for a question.
Thank you, Alan. I have a question about ostensible federal jurisdiction for Trump to deputize Proud Boy types. It's primarily directed at Marjorie for the con law aspects and Jose for the practical control of police aspects. Quick preliminary, Marjorie, I read your 2 great articles in Truth Out on rights at risk from a Justice Barrett. And secondly, my Bible on fascism, the great Yale professor Timothy Snyder, 10 lessons for the on tyranny, 10 lessons for the 20 lessons for the 20th century. That's it. It's good that Trump can't read, or he'd use that as a checklist, a to-do list. All right, so question. Every even-numbered year, our elections are both federal and state. And the Constitution gives the the feds and localities joint control over them, wouldn't that give Trump an ostensible, arguable basis for deputizing, Proud Boy types to do mischief on the ground? That's the question.
I'll take a stab at it. The Second Amendment talks about a well-regulated militia called forth by state governments, not by the federal government, but by state governments. And paramilitaries are illegal in all states. So I don't think that Trump could legally deputize his right-wing thugs. The question is whether he'll call out the military, because he is commander-in-chief, A, and B, whether they will actually show up and do his bidding, or whether they will refuse orders or resign. And hopefully that's what will happen. Now, Veterans for Peace, which is another one of my organizations I'm on the board of, I'm not a veteran, I'm an ally. When he was sending his federal thugs into Portland, into DC, they were putting out information about counseling, military counseling, encouraging people to obey lawful orders, and pointing out their duty to disobey unlawful orders. And I think we'll see that pervasively if it comes to it. But I don't see Trump legally deputizing his paramilitaries.
Jose, your thoughts?
I'll defer to Professor Cohn on that. I think certainly for me that's quite informative on that. But I'll add, Jonathan, that one of the ways that federal governments end up getting a lot more influence in local government and state is through federal grant dollars. So we're seeing a huge investment in federal urban security initiative grants that is occurring. And when local municipalities that are starving for budgets take those under the guise of working with Homeland Security around all these other things that we've heard about, they often have requirements to them. And those requirements may often say you will allow federal agents to then engage in local law enforcement. So again, I come back to the local, where we have to really be very mindful that when we accept any federal dollars, schools, the same thing with No Child Left Behind. We pushed out civics education in part because we were taking federal dollars under Obama to push reading and math, right? That was a Democrat administration. Who was building on George Bush, a bipartisan push away from civics education. So I would say that, again, at the local level, we have a lot of power at the local level to say, no, we will not accept that grant if it requires us to then give up our local rights. The way we give up our local rights is because we accept money from other agencies, and that's where the partnerships become clouded, and therefore we then give up those much valued local, the ability at the local level, as Professor Cohn said, to protect ourselves. So I'll just say, be mindful of those grants that we get.
Thank you, Jose. And I think Leon wants to speak because I see you've commented and you also just did that with your finger. And for the panelists, after each question, maybe if you have a thought you want to add, just raise your hand old school style, and I'll be try to vigilant and look around and catch all of you. Okay. Okay, be Leon, then Quasi. Go ahead, Leon.
Oh, I would so have enjoyed spending time talking about those Rome parallels, because that comes up for me a lot, and I get to teach the agenda training every year, so that's interesting. But I want to comment more on this question and the idea of deputizing Proud Boys or calling up these militias, because on the one hand, Trump has shown repeatedly that he does not really care about legality and will often claim something is legal even if it is not. And as long as enough people think that it is, that he gets away with it in the short term, the damage will be done before the courts manage to stop it. And I think there is also a precedent in our history for the federal government getting involved with militias, because we saw that under George Washington with the Whiskey Rebellion. You know, the president called up militias and led a 12,000-man militia up to put down what they saw as a threat. So if he could say disorders in Portland, such and such there, I think that there is at least a precedent that would make it difficult to stop it from happening, at least in time to really matter. So it is a legitimate concern, and him calling out in a debate, you know, like stand by, he's clearly thinking about it. And a lot is really going to depend on how loyal groups like the Secret Service and whatnot are to the Constitution if he refuses to step down after losing. That also is a fear. I mean, he still has weeks, you know, weeks and weeks and weeks as the lame duck to cause all kinds of mischief and try and stay in power.
Quasi, then Ray.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about someone who has already indicated that he is willing to abrogate the results of a national election if he thinks he can get away with it. And you know, I was reading the other day that there are 300 million firearms in private hands in the United States. How many of those firearms do you think are in the hands of progressive people? Not many. Okay, and you know, I mean, in Texas is 51 million in Texas alone. All right, and you know, one of the hallmarks of fascism is a disregard for legalism. I mean, you know, the only pass that they give toward legalism is to the extent that it can allow them to accumulate more power. And if they can find stratagems to take a wrecking ball, to long established legal rights, if they can whip up enough popular support for it, they'll do it. So, I mean, I think that's the kind of character that we're dealing with in the White House right now. This is a man who, I mean, has made statements and actions in the middle of a pandemic, you know, but, you know, we have a bigger problem than Trump, which is the fact that so many people are willing to put up with this. And again, that's what we have to read. But yeah, I think it'd be a mistake for us to think that Trump is going to care about legalisms that much.
Yeah, we lost you a little bit there, but I think we actually got all the words in, though it sort of sped up there at the end. Thank you so much, Quasi, and thank you, Liam, earlier, and Ray, you're up.
Okay, I just want to make 2 points. One is we've been talking about the parallels with Hitler and Germany, and actually it's a great thing if you want to look at this. It's a series called Genius about Einstein, and it actually you know, they enact some of these periods in history when I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a Jewish person that was one of the administrators in the administration, and they killed him, shot him, and then threw a bomb into his car. And the goal was to try to cause a civil war over race, so that they could then come in and say, look, we'll save you from the civil war with totalitarian regime. And this is almost what's going on here. So take a look at that. I think it's called Genius. I think it's on Hulu. It's a really good series about Einstein. So I wanted to just mention that. And one other point. Eric Prince, Blackwater Worldwide, now named something else. This is a corporate, private military with basically unlimited, you know, not unlimited, but huge potential for arms and so forth. And they have a whole factory which makes you know, tank type, you know, vehicles that they've been using to come into riots and so forth. This is the kind of thing that I'm worried about that hasn't been mentioned yet. That is the corporations that are really tied to Trump and the right really want to see they don't want to see a Green New Deal. They don't want to see any of their power diminished. And so they will do that. It is a big fear in my mind, because I was working in that area for a number of years. Fortunately, we were able to stop them from coming into San Diego. I have to hand that to the community out here that we got a recall election going in. But they just continue to pop up here and there, and they're not any less powerful today. So that was my 2 cents on that. That Genius program, very, very good.
Oh, thank you so much, Ray. So we are getting close to time, and so we have Ruth, Danette, and Michael, and then hopefully I'll have time to read Art's thoughts there. If we can go just about a minute to 60 seconds each, Ruth, Danette, and Michael, and then a final wraparound for whoever wants to answer to the 3 questions, and then if there's time permitting, I'll include Art's questions. Go for it. Ruth, you're up.
Okay, thanks. All right. First off, I want to say that, in case people don't know this, please get the word out. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law has an 866-hour vote number, and that is an election protection number that, ordinary citizens can call if they have any problems. So, if we're able to get that out to people, obviously we have our own networks, but a lot of other people, who are not part of our network, that's something they can do. The other thing is that Dan Sherrill of Roots Action has got people that he wants to have call those who want to do green voting or sit this out or whatever. And he's also got this plan about swapping votes so that somebody in California will vote for a third-party candidate because we're going to go Democrat and then get those people to vote Biden. It's a strange idea, but if it works, it works. So if people want, it's Dan Sherrill, SHERELL at Roots Action. The thing that I wanted to ask Ray, and I've been on calls with him, is there any legality to states not keeping ballot images? Are they allowed to just willy-nilly decide whether they're going to keep them or not? That's number one. And number two, the poll tapes, that's not the ballot images, right? Those are the actual tallies, so that those are, kind of our hedge against not keeping ballot images.
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to answer now or
yeah, please. Oh,
it's up to the moderator.
Yeah, please, Ray. Please go ahead. And
Okay.
then we'll go next.
Okay, so very quick answers because I want to. So the ballot images are usually considered public record. I mean, they are made by the government. So under the public records law, they should be released because there really is no private information in these ballots. However, what they do is they say that there might be some way that somebody can figure out how somebody voted, and it would be very difficult to do. But there is some like remote chance it could happen. So that's what they rely upon to keep these private. In California, they're still trying to keep them private. The only county that did provide all the ballots was San Francisco. All the rest of them, of the top 24 that we work with, said no. Now, so that's the story. There's still a battle about these ballot images and whether they have to, first of all, preserve them and not delete them. That was a battle in Florida, because in Florida, you can get them once they're not deleted. So they have the public records law that we can get them later, but the trouble is it's too far downstream. And this reflects on what Ruth was just asking. The poll tapes. Now, I don't really think the poll tapes are really all that valuable, except for one minor or major thing. It's to give us a foot in the door to be able to file these judicial challenges within the time period, and then to get to the ballot images because they've said no so far. So that's why they're important this year. I think as time goes on, we'll be able to get these ballot images more routine as we get the laws turned around and the recognition that these indeed are public records.
Thank you so much, Ray. And Danette had to drop off. Undoubtedly, she has a campaign event for her campaign. Michael Goldman, you're the last question, and then we'll go for final comments from everybody, which I'll also throw in Art's question from the.
Yeah, going back to the use of troops, I was just wondering, and it can be for any one of the panelists or all of them, is how would the National Guards fit into this? And can Trump federalize a National Guard in the various states? so that they're no longer under state control?
Okay, so we're gonna take that question. Everybody have that in mind from Mike. And I did want to throw out again, Art asked about, for each scenario that Marjorie Cohen mentioned in the various ways Trump can try to steal the election, is there a good counter strategy for progressives and or others to have formulated? So that fits, of course, with what Mike is saying, and Mike is asking right now. Art also asked about the possibility of general strike, if anybody can elaborate on that. And then finally, Art also asked, what scenarios can each of you imagine, and this fits with the first one, would result in Trump not getting away with stealing this election? So Art's asking 3 sort of positive progressive response questions. How can we respond to the negative scenarios that we've imagined and Marjorie outlined in her first comments? The possibility of a general strike as such, and who's talking about it in particular. And then what are the scenarios in which Trump tries to steal the election, but he doesn't succeed? And then also throw in Mike's comments about the, I see Quasi wants to go first, so you'll go first. I was hoping everybody would give their summary, but if you do have more to say later, because other people say, by all means, chime in, Quasi, but why don't you go first? And
well, I think that something along the lines of a general strike, mass actions along the lines of what the women's marches were when Trump was first elected is very important. However, and look, I don't like this scenario, but it's what we are actually materially dealing with right now. I think it would be a huge mistake to encourage or passively go along with leaders from the American military who are not willing to go along with Trump for them to resign their offices. I think that what we would need to demand of the military, and it's one of the biggest mistakes that Trump has made. He has alienated most of the leadership of the US military and a lot of the rank and file soldiers, who a large percentage are Black and brown, by the way, from very poor communities. So I think that what a movement to defend the Constitution, to carry out their responsibility to defend our Constitution, and not to just passively walk away from their offices. Because if that happens, we are really armed manifestations, and again, it's not new, is something that has historically been the case with these movements. All these armed manifestations, we would be crazy to passively encourage military leaders and others who are willing to resist Trump, or at least not support him, to just passively walk away.
Thank you so much. If I can chime in, we have signed on to a similar type statement across organizations that's going to be released on Monday, similar to what Quasi said, Progressive Democrats of America has signed on. And also our political director is working through back channels with recent officers, high officers in the US military, to encourage exactly the point you made, that it is not to resign, it is to take an active posture of resistance to such directives from Trump. So we have been sort of whipping around in a specific order. We're not seeing any hands. I'll go back to that order. And Marjorie, your final thoughts. And I suppose we'll get to you in a couple, Leon, but Marjorie, if you want to tackle final thoughts.
Yes, well, people were talking about not just, not just telling people that they have to vote against Trump, but rather being positive, voting for something. And I think that at the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, the Democrats did a good job of making the Affordable Care Act central, particularly now in the time of a pandemic, with stories, what would happen if people lost their health care. But the thing that the Democrats didn't do was to explain why the Republicans and Trump are so intent on getting rid of it. It's not just because it was Obamacare. It's because of the insurance companies and the tremendous lobby. The 70 different attempts in Congress to get rid of the Affordable Care Act all failed. And they keep saying, we've got a plan, we haven't seen the plan. So I think that's something, people don't want to lose their health care, especially now. And in terms of court packing, if in fact Barrett gets on the court, which she will, unless Trump, unless she or two Republicans just disappear, is to expand the number of justices on the court if Biden gets in and if the Senate it goes back into Democratic hands. And there's nothing in the Constitution about how many members of the court there will be, or there should be. They can expand the number to 13 or whatever, and also set term limits. And there would have to be the filibuster would have to be changed, but those are some things that could happen.
My understanding, just quickly, is that the term limits would require a constitutional amendment. The rest of everything you said would not. Am I correct on that? Yeah.
Right. But expanding the number of justices would not.
Right. Correct. Is it okay if we go just Jose, then Liam, and then final thought from Ray?
Just in the interest of time, I'll just add again that while we focus our eyes and ears and conscience at the federal level, at the end, if he wins, resistance will come at the local level. Please, let's make sure we keep focusing on local school boards, local city councils, local supervisors, county supervisors, because ultimately that was the resistance strategy against integration, against civil rights, and they did it quite effectively until they were able to get the courts, right? So I think that I look forward to work with folks on that, and thank you for inviting me to this panel, and power to the people, and might we use it wisely.
Thank you so much, Jose. Forgive me if I try to nominate you for the U.S. Senate if Kamala Harris becomes vice president. And Liam O'Mara, hope to see you in the House, of course. Your final thoughts.
Okay, so there was a question on federalizing National Guard forces. So just to simply answer that one, because I didn't hear anyone bring it up, that actually is done on a regular basis. The federal government does have the ability to call up National Guard units and has done it. We often tend to send National Guard units in first during wartime situations and then use the full-time professional military to train more soldiers. We've done that repeatedly in major wars in the US. So it is a possibility. As far as deterring Trump from trying to stage some kind of nonsense that we've been bringing up here, I think we need to really get people together behind the idea of a general strike, and not just as an abstract, airy thing, but consciously make preparations to do so very publicly in as large a coalition as possible. Because if you see that kind of preemptive demonstration of people power behind it, it may actually help to keep some of the institutional structures honest and deter them from actually supporting that sort of usurpation of power. If we're actually willing to be in the streets in large numbers, if Trump tries to stay in power, he may actually step down. If we do not show the willingness to do so, and American history is, if any American history is any indication, we often do not stand up for our rights as well as we should. If we do not show the willingness to do so, he may well try to stay in office, and we should be prepared for that, I think. And then, yeah, I see another donation link there. I am actually running for office, even though I'm not talking about it. So if you want a historian's voice in Congress, I'd love to serve, and we need to get rid of crooked Ken Calvert. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for inviting me to this.
Thank you, Liam. And can you private chat message me with your contact information? I'd like to invite you onto a national PDA call, if I can do that. Can you throw that into the chat right now? Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Ray Lutz, final thoughts?
Okay, I done some thought about this general strike notion, and I got to be honest with you, I'm a little bit worried about it because I think it might backfire. It might backfire because they'll be saying, look what the left is doing, and so we got to fight it. I think it might give them more power. So I'm kind of queasy about that. However, I will say that I have this focus on trying to get transparency. I'm trying to get people out there and photographing and video recording and getting as much transparency and as much stuff brought to light as we can. And I think that might be the way to fight back, not with guns, but with more information. I get the information flowing so we can see what's going on. I just don't know if the general strikes. I just wanted to put that notion in to let people think about that and what the repercussions would be, because I don't think it's necessarily, I don't think they'll give up just because a general strike happens and they say, okay, well, you know, it's hurting us too much and therefore we're giving up. Hey, that's not going to happen. What they'll say is, okay, look what the left is doing. They're hurting you. They're the ones that are wrong, and therefore we're getting more power. So be careful of this general strike notion. Really think it through before you start getting on board with that one. But again, it's citizensoversight.org. Please visit the page, go to the sign up, get your information signed up. We'll put you on the list so you can help us out. And Crowdwatch is our new initiative, and that can hopefully save our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Lynn Jacobson, you're motioning to me. Do you have something to say quickly? I know that there was a woman who wanted to speak whose name was Anne. She didn't have her hand up digitally, but if somebody has like 30 seconds quickly.
It's me, and I did have my hand up, and I had a question for quite a while. I wrote it in. Can you hear me?
I must have missed it. These do fly.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So the question is for Marjorie, and when she was talking about, you know, the outcome of the election, and if it were to go to the Trump resisted, she said something about one state, each state would have a vote if it went to the states to decide. Is there a percentage of the popular vote that would override that?
No.
So no landslide would even help if it got to that.
No, it wouldn't, but Marjorie, please.
No, the problem is that it would go to the House of Representatives and each state would have one vote, and there are more red states than blue states. So it's a way to circumvent the official electoral college and basically cheat. And this could well end up in the Supreme Court. And so I think Trump is very savvy to want Amy Coney Barrett on there, who, by the way, worked on Bush v. Gore for the Bush forces.
Yes.
I think she would be a loyal foot soldier in Trump's army.
Yes, of course. Well, but it doesn't matter then, the percentage, even if it's an overwhelming percentage of popular vote.
No,
okay,
it would. Thank you. And look, we are out of time. Look, thank you so much. Some of the organizers of this are asking me to please close it down. I know we could talk all night. Dorothy, I'm going to give you 15 seconds only because I love you. So you get 15 seconds literally, Dorothy, and then we're going to say thank you to everybody and go. Dorothy?
The Democrats are working on flipping enough states so that we will then have a majority of the states, and we would win in that case.
So thank you so much. She's correct. It's 26 to 24 right now in the states. So states like Montana, Alaska, with single congressional districts that are Republican but are considered to possibly be in play. If they flip over to Democrats, then that could switch to 26, 24. For the Democrats, as we know, oftentimes polls are closed in a place like Alaska, and Republicans come home to voting Republican in congressional races, and we end up not picking up that seat. But those are the kind of states that matter right now. For some reason, I can see somebody's shared screen. I think it's Mike Fowler's, which is a rather undynamic way in terms of cinematography to end this meeting. But I want to thank everyone.
Wait. Before we go, because this is our chapter meeting, right? So number one, Alan, thank you so much. Thank you so much for moderating this. Thank you so much to our speakers. You all were absolutely amazing. Some of you have been mentors to me. Some of you are geniuses that I just met recently. Ray, I've been trying to get you to speak at my chapter meetings for over a year, and I'm so excited that you finally spoke at one. And also, thank you to everybody who helped me get these speakers. Dr. Hemming Chow, Dorothy Reich, Bill Hess. I mean, you all did such amazing work to